I met Brandon at a friend's barbecue in the summer of 2014, and honestly, I knew right away he was different from the guys I usually dated. He was 28, had this quiet confidence about him, and while everyone else was getting wasted and acting like idiots, he was actually having real conversations. I was 39 then, finally at a place in my life where I knew what I wanted, and I wasn't about to let some arbitrary number stop me from going after it. Age is just a number anyway, and Brandon was clearly mature for his age. He had his act together, steady job as a mechanical engineer, his own place, actually knew how to hold a conversation without turning everything into some juvenile joke. The thing that attracted me most was how he listened when I talked. Really listened. Not just waiting for his turn to speak like most men do. When I told him about my job at the dental office, he asked follow-up questions. When I mentioned my dreams of maybe opening my own practice someday, he didn't brush it off or change the subject. He was genuinely interested in what I had to say, which was refreshing after years of dating emotionally unavailable guys who only cared about themselves. We started seeing each other regularly after that, and I could tell he was falling for me hard. Brandon would drive 45 minutes just to take me to dinner. Never complained when I wanted to try some new restaurant he'd never heard of. Always opened doors and paid for everything, without making it into some big production. He was thoughtful in ways that showed he was raised right. Remembered things I mentioned in passing. Surprised me with little gifts that proved he was actually paying attention. I felt like I was finally dating a real man instead of some overgrown boy. The physical chemistry was incredible too. Brandon was athletic from all his cycling and gym time, and he had this way of making me feel absolutely beautiful. I'd catch him looking at me sometimes with this expression like he couldn't believe I was actually with him. And honestly, that kind of adoration was exactly what I needed after my last relationship disaster. He made me feel desired and appreciated in ways I'd forgotten were possible. By 2017, it just made sense for us to move in together. Brandon had gotten a promotion at work and was making decent money, enough that we could afford a really nice place together. I loved the idea of us building something real, creating a home that was ours. He let me handle most of the decorating decisions, which showed he trusted my taste and wanted me to feel comfortable. We fell into this perfect routine where I'd handle the domestic stuff, meal planning, keeping the place organized, making sure we had a social life while he focused on advancing his career. I was good at managing the relationship side of things, making sure we stayed connected to our friends, planning date nights, keeping things interesting between us. Brandon was naturally more of a homebody, perfectly content to spend entire weekends working on his computer or tinkering with his bike. So I had to push him sometimes to actually go out and live a little. But that's what relationships are about, balancing each other out, right? I brought spontaneity and social energy to his life, while he provided stability and security to mine. The wedding in 2019 was absolutely perfect. We'd been together 5 years by then, and I felt like we'd really built something solid together. Brandon had proposed with this gorgeous ring. Clearly, he'd been paying attention when I pointed out styles I liked, and he'd planned this romantic proposal at the spot where we'd first met. It was like something out of a movie. All our friends kept commenting on how lucky we were to have found each other, how perfect we seemed together. Planning the wedding was mostly my thing, obviously, since Brandon didn't really have opinions about flowers or centerpieces or any of that stuff. He was happy to let me handle the details while he focused on work, which was fine with me because I actually enjoyed putting it all together. His income had grown significantly over the years. He was making close to 6 figures by then, while I was still stuck at the dental office making barely $40,000. So we could afford to do the wedding right without stressing about money. The ceremony itself was beautiful, seeing Brandon waiting for me at the altar with tears in his eyes, knowing that this incredible man had chosen me, wanted to spend his life with me. It felt like everything was finally falling into place. We honeymooned in Europe for 2 weeks, and Brandon was so attentive and romantic the entire time. He'd researched all these amazing restaurants and museums, planned out this perfect itinerary that balanced the things I wanted to see with experiences we could share together. But marriage is different from dating. Obviously, the first year or two were great. Don't get me wrong, but gradually I started noticing things that bothered me. Brandon became increasingly focused on his work, bringing projects home, staying late at the office more often. His income kept climbing. He was making over $120,000 by 2022, while I was still making basically the same $38,000 I'd been making for years. But it felt like the more successful he became, the more distant he got. He'd come home and immediately disappear into his home office, working on side projects or updating his portfolio or whatever engineering stuff he was obsessing over that week. When I'd try to talk to him about my day, he'd give me these distracted responses while typing on his laptop. If I suggested we go out for dinner or drinks, He'd say he was too tired or had too much work to catch up on. Weekend plans became this constant negotiation where I had to practically beg him to do anything social. The worst part was how logical he was about everything. Brandon approached our relationship like it was some kind of engineering project that needed to be optimized. Date nights had to be scheduled weeks in advance. Spontaneous trips were impossible because they weren't in the budget he'd created. Even our intimate life became predictable. Same routine. Same timing. No passion or excitement. I started feeling like I was married to a robot instead of a man. I tried talking to him about it, explaining that I needed more excitement in our relationship, more spontaneity, more emotional connection. But Brandon would just sit there analyzing what I was saying like it was data to be processed instead of feelings to be understood. He'd ask questions like, what specifically would you like me to change? Or how can we create systems to address these concerns? It was infuriating. I didn't want systems. I wanted passion. I wanted a husband who couldn't keep his hands off me, who surprised me with romantic gestures, who made me feel alive. Instead, I got spreadsheets, literally. Brandon created this elaborate budget tracking system and wanted to review our expenses every month, like we were business partners instead of lovers. He planned our social calendar with the same methodical approach he used for work projects. Even our conversations became these logical discussions where he'd want to problem solve instead of just listening and empathizing. By early 2023, I felt completely disconnected from him. We were like roommates who happened to share a bed. Brandon would get up at 5:30 every morning for his cycling routine, spend the day at work, come home and disappear into his office until bedtime. Weekends were for household maintenance and his photography hobby. I felt invisible in my own marriage. That's when I started spending more time online, joining Facebook groups related to my interests, just looking for some kind of human connection. There were groups for people in healthcare, groups for women dealing with marriage issues, groups for people who felt stuck in their lives. It was refreshing to interact with people who actually responded to what I was saying instead of trying to solve me like I was some kind of equation. Jay was in one of the healthcare groups, and he started commenting on my posts with these thoughtful, insightful responses that showed he actually understood what I was going through. He was dealing with his own relationship challenges, feeling unappreciated by his partner, struggling with that same sense of being taken for granted that I was experiencing. We started private messaging, just as friends initially, sharing our frustrations and supporting each other. Jay lived about 90 minutes away, but he felt closer to me than my own husband did. He remembered details about conversations we'd had weeks earlier. He'd check in on me when I was having a bad day at work. He sent me funny memes and articles he thought I'd enjoy. It was like having a best friend who actually cared about my thoughts and feelings, something I'd been missing for years. Our conversations gradually became more personal. Jay would tell me how beautiful I looked in my profile pictures, how lucky my husband was to have someone like me. He'd say things like, if you were my wife, I'd never take you for granted, or you deserve so much better than someone who doesn't appreciate what he has. It felt incredible to be seen and valued by someone, even if it was just through messages. I started looking forward to our conversations more than anything else in my day. While Brandon was in his office working on whatever boring project consumed his attention that week, I'd be chatting with Jay about everything, our dreams, our disappointments, our hopes for the future. He was funny and charming in ways that Brandon had never been. Jay would flirt with me, make me laugh, remind me that I was still a desirable woman worth pursuing. When Jay suggested we meet in person, just for coffee, it seemed natural. We'd been talking for months by then, and he felt like one of my closest friends. Brandon was going through one of his particularly distant phases, working late every night and spending his weekends on some cycling training program, barely acknowledging I existed. I deserved to have at least one person in my life who enjoyed my company. Meeting Jay was like stepping into a completely different world. He was even more attractive in person. Tall, great smile, dressed well, smelled amazing. But more than that, he was completely focused on me from the moment we sat down. He asked about my drive, complimented my outfit, wanted to hear all about my work and my interests. For 3 hours, I felt like the most fascinating woman in the world. Jay told me how much our conversations meant to him, how talking to me was the highlight of his day. He said his partner didn't understand him the way I did, didn't appreciate his sense of humor, or share his interests. We talked about how unfair it was that we'd both ended up with people who took us for granted when we had so much to offer. By the time we hugged goodbye, I was practically floating. Our messages became more frequent after that, more intimate. Jay would tell me he couldn't stop thinking about our time together, how beautiful I'd looked, how much he wished we lived closer. I found myself checking my phone constantly, hoping for a message from him. When Brandon would ignore me or dismiss something I said, I'd think about how differently Jay treated me, how valued he made me feel. The physical attraction was undeniable, Jay would send me pictures, nothing inappropriate, just shots of him at work or out with friends, and I'd find myself staring at them longer than I should. He'd compliment my appearance in ways that made me feel sexy and desired again. When I posted pictures, his comments were always the first I looked for, and his responses made my heart race in ways Brandon's presence hadn't in years. Meeting him became a regular thing. I'd tell Brandon I was having girls' nights or visiting my sister, and instead I'd drive to meet Jay at restaurants or coffee shops halfway between our cities. Those few hours with him were the brightest parts of my weeks. Jay treated me like I was precious, like spending time with me was a privilege rather than an obligation. He'd hold my hand across the table, look into my eyes while I talked, laugh at my jokes in ways that made me feel witty and charming. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing, and I'd drive home feeling more alive than I had in months. Meanwhile, Brandon would barely look up from his computer when I walked in, maybe ask if I'd had fun in that distracted way that showed he wasn't really listening to the answer. The first time Jay kissed me, I knew I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross, but in that moment, feeling desired and cherished by someone who actually saw me, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Brandon had been emotionally unavailable for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be wanted. Jay's attention was like water in the desert. I couldn't get enough. When he suggested we get a hotel room, I should have said no. I knew it was wrong. Knew it would complicate everything. But I also knew that I deserved to feel passionate and alive. Deserved to be with someone who couldn't keep his hands off me. Brandon and I hadn't had any real intimacy in months. And when we did, it was mechanical and routine. Jay made me feel like a goddess. Those afternoons with him were like living in a completely different reality. He'd book us a nice room, always have flowers or champagne waiting, treat the whole experience like we were lovers in some romantic movie. The way he touched me, looked at me, whispered how incredible I was. It reminded me who I used to be before marriage turned me into some invisible household manager. I started creating more elaborate excuses to see him, dental conferences in nearby cities, visits to friends Brandon had never met, shopping trips that required overnight stays. Jay was always understanding about the complexity of our situation, never pressured me or made demands. He'd tell me how much he wished things were different, how he dreamed about what life could be like if we'd met each other first. Our text conversations became increasingly intimate. Jay would tell me he was falling in love with me, that I was everything his partner wasn't, that talking to me was the only thing that made his days bearable. I found myself saying the same things back, meaning them completely. For the first time in years, I felt truly understood and appreciated by someone. Brandon remained completely oblivious to everything. He was so wrapped up in his work and his hobbies that he never questioned my whereabouts or noticed changes in my behavior. I'd come home from seeing Jay glowing with happiness, and Brandon would just assume I'd had a good time with my girlfriends. His lack of attention to me had created the perfect cover for my relationship with Jay. I started to fantasize about what life would be like if I could be with Jay full-time. He understood me in ways Brandon never had, made me laugh, made me feel beautiful and desired every single day. When I was with Jay, I remembered who I used to be, confident, funny, passionate. With Brandon, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. The guilt was there, obviously, but it was overshadowed by how alive Jay made me feel. I'd tried for years to get Brandon's attention, to inject some passion and spontaneity into our marriage. I'd suggested date nights, planned surprises, bought lingerie, tried everything I could think of to reconnect with him. But he was always too busy, too tired, too focused on other priorities. Jay never made me feel like I was competing with spreadsheets for attention. By late 2023, I was essentially living a double life. During the week, I was Brandon's invisible wife, managing our household while he focused on work and hobbies. But my real emotional life was with Jay, our daily messages, our stolen afternoons together, our dreams about a future where we could be open about our feelings. I felt more married to Jay than I did to my actual husband. I should have realized Brandon would eventually notice something. He was an engineer, after all, trained to spot patterns and analyze data. But I'd gotten comfortable with his inattention, confident that his work obsession would continue to provide cover for my relationship with Jay. The night everything fell apart, I'd had a particularly stressful day at work and ended up drinking way too much wine while texting with Jay about our plans to meet the following weekend. I woke up the next morning with a splitting headache and no memory of how I'd gotten to bed. Brandon was already gone for his morning bike ride, which was typical, so I didn't think anything of it. The next few weeks continued normally. Work, household routines, messages with Jay, Brandon buried in his latest project. If anything, Brandon seemed even more distant than usual. But I assumed he was just stressed about work. Jay and I had been talking about taking a long weekend together, maybe driving somewhere romantic where we could spend real time together without worrying about running into anyone we knew. I was researching bed and breakfasts within driving distance, imagining what it would be like to wake up next to someone who actually wanted to be there. The fantasy was becoming more appealing than my reality. Then came that Tuesday afternoon in October when everything exploded. I was finishing up with a patient when the receptionist told me someone was there to see me. I walked out to find this official-looking man asking if I was Danielle Morrison. And when I confirmed, he handed me an envelope and said I'd been served. The entire waiting room went silent as I stood there holding divorce papers with my name on them. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what I was reading. Irreconcilable differences? Division of assets? Legal separation? The words swam on the page as I realized that somehow Brandon had found out about Jay and decided to blow up our entire marriage without even talking to me first. I rushed to my car and called him immediately. Brandon, I was just served at work. What's going on? What is this? My voice came out higher than I intended, panic making it hard to breathe. It's what you think it is, he said in this calm, cold tone I'd never heard from him before. But we didn't even talk. Why would you blindside me like this? I was practically shouting into the phone, aware that my coworkers could probably hear me through the parking lot. He hung up on me, actually hung up the phone like I was some stranger bothering him instead of his wife of 4 years. I tried calling back 3 times, but it went straight to voicemail. I couldn't go back into work in that state. So I told them I had a family emergency and drove home in a complete daze. Brandon's car was in the driveway when I got there, which was unusual for a Tuesday afternoon. I found him in the living room, sitting calmly on the couch like he was waiting for me. There was something different about his posture. His expression, like he was looking at a stranger instead of his wife. Brandon, what the hell is going on? Why are you trying to divorce me without even discussing whatever's bothering you? I set my purse down and tried to keep my voice level, but inside I was completely panicking. It's not what it looks like, I said quickly. He was just a friend. I never meant for it to go that far. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. And I realized immediately that I'd basically confirmed whatever he thought he knew. Brandon just stared at me for a long moment, then said, I already contacted your parents. They're on their way. You'll be staying with them until the divorce is finalized. The casual way he said it, like he was discussing weekend plans, made my stomach drop. Please, Brandon, please don't do this. We can fix it. I'll block him. I'll do therapy. Whatever you want. I could hear the desperation in my own voice, but I didn't care. This couldn't be happening. You didn't think about fixing it when you were meeting him at hotels and lying to my face. So, don't cry to me now? His voice was still that same eerily calm tone, like he was reading from a script. Hotels? He knew about the hotels. Somehow he'd found out everything. And instead of confronting me when it happened, he'd been planning this whole legal ambush. I wanted to ask how he knew, wanted to defend myself. But the words wouldn't come. Brandon had never been cruel before. But there was something almost surgical about the way he was dismantling our marriage. My parents arrived within an hour, and the disappointment on their faces was almost worse than Brandon's coldness. Dad helped me pack my clothes, while Mom sat in the living room, making awkward, small talk with Brandon. I kept waiting for him to change his mind, to realize he was being dramatic and we could work through this like adults. But he just sat there answering my mother's questions politely while I stuffed my life into suitcases upstairs. The drive to my parents' house was humiliating. At 39 years old, I was moving back into my childhood bedroom because my husband had decided to throw away 4 years of marriage instead of having a conversation. Mom kept asking what had happened, and I couldn't bring myself to explain the whole situation. I just said we'd been having problems and Brandon had overreacted. Living with my parents again was like being transported back to high school, except worse because everyone knew I was there because my marriage had failed. Dad would give me these disappointed looks over dinner, and Mom kept making pointed comments about commitment and working through difficulties. They'd loved Brandon, thought he was the best thing that ever happened to me, and now they were trying to figure out what I'd done to mess it up. The divorce proceedings were a nightmare. Brandon had hired this shark of a lawyer who'd apparently been preparing for weeks before I even knew what was happening. They had documentation of everything. My trips to see Jay, the hotel receipts somehow, even screenshots of messages I thought were private. I felt completely blindsided by how thorough and calculated Brandon's approach was. My lawyer kept telling me to be realistic about what I could expect from the settlement. Brandon made more than 3 times what I did, and I'd gotten used to a lifestyle his income supported. I'd given up opportunities to advance my own career, to focus on our relationship, and now I was being penalized for that sacrifice. It felt completely unfair that he got to keep everything while I was starting over with nothing. The worst part was that Jay started pulling away as soon as the divorce became real. When it was just an affair, when I was married and unavailable, he'd been completely devoted. But once I was actually getting divorced and could potentially be with him, he suddenly became busy and distant. Our messages became shorter, less frequent. He stopped making plans to see me. By the time the divorce was finalized 4 months later, Jay had basically ghosted me completely. I tried calling him a few times, but he'd give me these vague excuses about needing space and figuring out his own situation. It became clear that he'd never been serious about a real relationship. He just enjoyed the excitement of the forbidden affair. Once I was actually available, I wasn't interesting anymore. Brandon got to keep the house, most of our shared assets, everything we'd built together. The judge said I wasn't entitled to spousal support since the marriage had ended due to my infidelity. And I walked away with basically what I'd brought into the relationship years earlier. 4 years of marriage. And I had nothing to show for it except legal bills and a broken heart. I tried reaching out to Brandon after everything was finalized, thinking maybe we could at least talk about what had happened. I sent him long messages, explaining that I'd made a mistake, that I'd been going through a difficult time and hadn't handled it well. I told him I missed him, missed us, missed the life we'd built together. He never responded to any of it. Through mutual friends, I heard that Brandon was doing incredibly well. He'd gotten another promotion at work, bought an even nicer house, started a side business doing 3D modeling and CAD work. He was traveling, taking up photography, had joined some cycling club where he'd met new friends. Everyone said he seemed happier and more relaxed than he'd been in years. Meanwhile, I was living in my childhood bedroom at 39, working the same job I'd had for years, watching my life get smaller and smaller. I'd gained weight from stress and depression, stopped going out socially because I was embarrassed about my situation. Most of our mutual friends had sided with Brandon anyway, which I guess wasn't surprising given how the marriage had ended. I started checking his social media obsessively, even though it just made me feel worse. Brandon looked amazing, tan and fit from all his outdoor activities, smiling in photos from trips to places we'd never gone together, surrounded by new friends who clearly enjoyed his company. He'd even started dating someone, a nurse he'd met through friends, and she looked young and pretty and completely smitten with him. It's been over a year since the divorce was finalized, and I still think about reaching out to him sometimes. I'll see something that reminds me of a joke we used to share, or I'll hear a song that was playing during one of our good times, and I'll want to text him about it, but he's made it clear that he's moved on completely. And I'm just a chapter he's closed. I know people think I got what I deserved, that I threw away a good marriage for some fantasy that was never going to work out. But they don't understand how lonely I was, how invisible I felt in my own relationship. Brandon was a good provider. I'll give him that. But he was never emotionally available in the way I needed. I tried for years to get his attention, to inject some passion into our marriage, and he was always too busy or too logical to understand what I was asking for. Jay made me feel alive in ways Brandon never did. Yes, it ended badly. But for those few months, I remembered what it felt like to be desired and appreciated. I'm not proud of how I handled things, but I don't regret fighting for my own happiness. Maybe if Brandon had paid half as much attention to me as he did to his spreadsheets and cycling schedules, none of this would have happened. Now I'm starting over at almost 40, trying to rebuild a life that makes sense without the future I'd planned. Some days are better than others. I've started therapy, joined a gym, thinking about maybe taking some classes to advance my career. My parents are supportive, even if they don't fully understand what happened. I'm learning to be okay with being alone, though it's harder than I expected. I still wonder sometimes what would have happened if Brandon had just talked to me instead of going straight to lawyers. If he'd fought for our marriage instead of giving up the moment things got complicated. But maybe this is better for both of us. Maybe we were never as compatible as I thought we were, and it just took a crisis to make that clear. I hope he's happy with his new life, his new girlfriend, his successful career and active social life. I really do, and someday, I hope I'll be happy too, with whatever comes next for me. This isn't the ending I wanted, but it's the one I got, and I'm trying to make peace with that.